Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Badnock, and I'm part of the Community Lecture Series Organizing Committee, and it is my pleasure to invite you to our 5th of 6 lectures on our topic this year, Clearing the Air with Real Evidence. This lecture series was developed over 20 years ago to deepen the University of Montana and community connection by presenting a series of lectures featuring the researchers and faculty on the University of Montana campus. The original creators of this program realized that there's just a lot of great things going on at the University of Montana campus that who knows what's going on. And so we created this lecture series as an opportunity for the community to better appreciate some of the amazing work that's going on in the University of Montana campus. It takes a lot of work to pull this lecture series together. Not only the committee that is Chris Comer and Kitty Robbins and now retiring away from us is Don Hobby and Ann Boone, but we have the absolutely amazing assistance from Angela Weisenberger. Come on, come take a round of applause for Angela. She does amazing work pulling this together. And I should point out that this whole lecture series is put on by the Alumni Association to benefit the university. And they use their resources to put it on. You as ticket holders support that. But our Alumni Association, our alumni office does wonderful, wonderful things for the university, showcasing the university not only to the community, but to prospective students and alums. If you can, support the Alumni Association. If you're not a member, join. If you can send them some money, that's great too. It's really a worthy organization. They do great work for us. 1 week from tonight, we'll wrap up the series with a panel of some of our presenters getting together, and we'll be talking about how do we know the truth when the evidence is always changing. And that's especially true in the world of the internet, where you just are not sure what you're reading is true. We're going to explore that next week. And as always, the lecture series will conclude with a reception, which will be in the 300 rooms, which are just go out the doors and go left through the double doors and keep going. And enjoy a reception with our presenters, ask them questions, follow up, get to know them a little bit better. It's just a nice way to wrap up the series, and we'll be grateful if you can join us. As always, each lecture concludes with questions and answers. Because we are recording these lectures through a media assistance grant from MCAT, it's important that when you have questions at the end that we wait for us to bring you a microphone so you can make sure that we capture your question. For your information, the lecture series is going to begin to be broadcast or cablecast on MCAT beginning tomorrow night. And it begins at 9 o'clock tomorrow night on chapter 189. And it will be rebroadcast on Sunday at 5:30. If you don't have cable television, you can watch the lectures at mcat.org, where they have live streaming of the programs. Just get to mcat.org and channel 189. I'm almost done. Okay, anybody need to be reminded about their cell phones and silencing it? Because that helps. This year's lecture series topic is Beyond the Headlines, Clearing the Air with Real Evidence. Last week we heard Professor Jordan Gross talk to us about fact and fiction and unintended consequences in the criminal justice reform. Tonight we're going to take a little narrower approach, and we're going to hear from Professor and Department Chair Dusten Hollist of the UM Department of Sociology in a talk about the Montana juvenile justice system. There is nothing quite so heartbreaking as seeing a good kid getting caught doing bad things. Similarly, there are few things that are as satisfying as the stories of bad kids who turn their lives around and rejoin society as positive contributing members. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dusten Hollist as he discusses on how we in Montana can do more of the latter better.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think this thing is on. Sounds like it is. Can everybody hear me? All right. Well, thanks, Jeff, for the introduction. I want to start by saying that it's an extreme privilege to be here tonight, to be asked to speak as part of the 20th anniversary of the Community Lecture Series means a lot to me. 20 years ago, I was a graduate student at the University of Montana. And to be able to stand here tonight, having been able to raise my family here in Missoula, getting ready to complete my 15th year as a faculty member here at it's really special to me. I want to thank the speakers that went before me in the series. I've been to each of the talks. I thought that the speakers were well prepared. They had great insight into their fields of study. If you're here tonight to learn about fire behavior, you're going to be very disappointed. I'm just not going to be able to speak about that at all. Although maybe some of the kids I'll talk about lit some things on fire. I can't say for sure. I want to make sure and recognize the sponsors who contributed to the work that I'll be presenting tonight. And those sponsors are listed up on my slide. They include both national and state level collaborators and supporters, and also people here at So I'd like to begin by thanking the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the National Institute of Justice, in particular the Statistical Analysis Center funding mechanism within the Bureau of Justice Statistics for the grants that they've awarded to do the work that we've been doing here in Montana. I'd also like to recognize the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, who has supported some of our work. And I'd like to recognize the Annie E. Casey Foundation for their tireless support of improving detention conditions for youth in the United States. At the state level, I'd like to recognize what was formerly the Board of Crime Control, now the Bureau of Crime Control. That's a discussion for a different day. But also the Office of the Court Administrator for the Montana Supreme Court, in particular the Youth Court Division within that organization, which entrusted us with access to the Juvenile Court Assessment Tracking System, which is the state-level database where all of the information about juvenile court activities and the juveniles within those activities are located. And it's been a tremendous working relationship, and we've been able to do some great things, so I appreciate their support. Within the University of Montana, I want to recognize the Social Science Research Laboratory, and I know that he's not here tonight, but if Chuck Harris was here, the administrator in the SSRL, he would be very happy that I use the term laboratory and not lab. But because this is being recorded, I want to have stated for the record, it is easier to say Social Science Research Lab than laboratory. About 10 years ago, Chuck finally convinced me that we needed to reintegrate or restart a model that existed here when I was a graduate student. And it was a model where there were applied research projects going on in the lab. And I'm a firm believer that those experiences during my 2 years as a graduate student here at the University of Montana and the projects that I've been involved with since I came back provide essential learning opportunities to graduate and undergraduate students here at the University of Montana that we simply cannot provide in a classroom. And so I want to recognize the Criminology Research Group, who's responsible for all of the work that I'll be presenting tonight. I'm the voice tonight of the work that we've done, but certainly in no small measure could have accomplished even a fraction of it by myself. All right, my talk tonight is about evidence-based practice. And I'm specifically going to talk about a specific type of evidence-based practice, the use of risk assessment instruments to help inform detention decisions. And so what I need to do here tonight is I need to spend some time talking about what is evidence-based practice. I'm also going to need to talk a little bit about what it means to say place a kid in detention versus, on the other end of the spectrum, a juvenile who is put in secure confinement, a placement in secure confinement, which is kind of equivalent to being put in a penitentiary in the adult system. So I actually have a couple of slides that talk about incarceration. I'll try to be distinct when I talk about those, but I really like this definition by Greenwood and Welch about what evidence-based practice is. They cite it's the use of scientific principles to assess the available evidence on program effectiveness and to develop principles for best practices in any particular field. And the two things in particular that I like about that definition is it identifies that in order to do evidence-based practice, there has to be science and there has to be research in order to do that. And the other piece of this that I really appreciate is that the overall objective of evidence-based practice is to identify promising and best practices programs. It's kind of an interesting thought that evidence-based practice in the juvenile justice system isn't much older than the community lecture series. And I'll give you a brief example that I hope illustrates that. How many of you have heard about DARE, the Drug Education Resistance Program? Most of you have. I think many of us, there are a couple in here that may have actually went through the DARE program. Too old for that, but Program DARE was one of the most widely implemented, one of the most successfully implemented drug education programs in the United States. At its height, DARE was the program that was being used in over 75% of our public schools. Started in 1983, and it really wasn't until the mid-1990s that somebody raised their hand and said, hey, has anybody ever looked to see if DARE's actually working? And guess what happened when we started investigating whether or not the DARE program was effective? The evidence largely suggested that it was not. And so we'd spent over a decade, we'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars before we ever asked the question, is the program meeting its goals? Now DARE, I'm not going to argue against the philosophy of DARE. I agree that having an adult, non-family member around young people is by and large something that I would support. But the evidence suggests that the DARE program, when we started to examine it, started to do some evidence-based practice activities such as evaluations, and as the studies came in, meta-analyses kind of looking at the summaries of those evaluations, the results suggested that the program really wasn't the best program for introducing education about the harmful effects of drug, tobacco, and alcohol to youth and children. All right, I'm going to step back for just a second, and the figure that I have up on the overhead here, this is a longitudinal chart that shows the number of delinquency cases that have appeared in our juvenile court system really since 1960 through 2014. And there are a couple of things in this figure that I'd in particular like to point out. And the first of those is that the number of delinquency cases really peaked in the mid to late 1990s, about 1996, 1997, that pointer right there. And since that time, for approximately the last 20 years or so, total delinquency cases in juvenile courts in the United States have declined. And you'll notice that since 2008 through 2014, which was the end of this reporting period, a pretty steep decline in those cases. Despite the decline in the number of delinquency cases that are appearing in our juvenile courts across the country, there's remarkable consistency with regard to the proportion or percentage of those cases that involve detention. My apologies, I'm battling a cold a little bit. I'm going to take a drink off of that water a few times during the presentation. Since 1985, our evidence shows that about 1 in 5 court cases in the juvenile court results in a detention of the juvenile involved in that case. And it's remarkable how consistently that 20% of all of those cases that appear result in detention are. So if we think about the end of the reporting period, we think about 2014. This is kind of a good one. It's a pretty even number. There were a million, total cases in juvenile courts across the United States, and there were about 200,000, just over 200,000 of those cases that resulted in detention placement for the juvenile involved. And so here's the first point where I have to make a clear distinction about what I'm talking about with regard to detention. When I am using juvenile detention, I'm meaning that it's a short-term placement. Typically, over half of juvenile detention placements are less than 4 days. So it's something that is often needed in order to, I hope, do two things. The two conditions or two situations when we should be placing a youth in detention are: one, when they pose a significant public safety threat. To release the youth, if that youth poses a significant threat to public safety in terms of their likelihood for committing a future offense, then that's something we should be mindful of. The second condition where we should consider placing a youth in detention is if they pose a significant flight risk. If the youth, if they're let out of the detention placement, if that youth is likely not to come back for their court appearance or come back with their appointment with their probation officer, then those are the two times or the two situations under which we should consider using detention. The reality of it is, in the history of juvenile detention and incarceration in the United States, suggests that we use it far more often than that. And it's that issue that I'd like to turn to next. The bar graph that I have up here, this is one of two places in my presentation tonight where I want to just point out that the information there is based on incarceration and not detention. But what it does is it allows me to kind of give a framework for showing how much more common the use of placements for youth are in the United States compared to any country in the world. I always like it when the United States is in first place. This is one of those times where I wish we weren't. And if you look even at the kind of the second place, South Africa, the rate's 69 youth per 100,000 in the population. New Zealand, 68 per 100,000. We're 5 times higher than that. And this was data, it's a little bit old, 2008. But at that point in time, our per 100,000 youth placed in detention was 336 youth per 100,000 in the population. So just something that our history suggests that we've done far more often than the evidence regarding public safety threats and flight risks, I believe, merit the use of detention for. All right, so a couple of things that I want to just kind of point out is that we have spent decades thinking about the problem of youth detention. And I really wanted to share this Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974 just to give you kind of a history about this isn't something that we just started thinking about. Evidence-based practice, you know, a couple of decades, but thinking about issues associated to detention a much longer history, and really culminating in this act in 1974, where the federal government just made a series of statements. And those statements were that we shouldn't be placing status offenders in secure placement and detention. And I want to be clear, I know last week Professor Gross talked about a status offense as associated with a specific characteristic of juveniles. I'm even using this much more specifically. When I talk about a status offense, I'm talking about the youth status. A status offense is an act of delinquency where the citation can only be written to somebody who is under the age of 18. Some of the things that fall under the umbrella of status offenses are things like minor in possession of alcohol, underage smoking, things like school truancy, and my personal favorite, incorrigibility. All right, talk about, if my mother was here, I was definitely an incorrigible youth. I don't really know what that means, to be honest with you. A couple other points about the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was the act sought to promote sight and sound separation of adults and juveniles, and to also remove juveniles from adult facilities. Prior to 1974, and really even since 1974, one of our biggest challenges is finding placements where youth are not commingling with adult offenders. So this idea of sight and sound separation doesn't really mean that there has to be a distinct facility for a juvenile to be held in or detained in, but if we're detaining juveniles and adults in a facility, there has to be enough distance between the juveniles and adults that they can't hear each other and they can't see each other. And the final one really is something that I wish I could talk a little bit more about. It's something that our group has worked on quite a bit, reducing the number of minorities in secure facilities. This was the first statement of what the federal government originally referred to as disproportionate minority confinement. Something that today we talk about as disproportionate minority contact because we recognize that at the end of this thing, that confinement decision, there are at least 8 other decision points, starting with the initial arrest decision with law enforcement, where minorities and whites could be unequally or disproportionately dealt with in formal versus informal methods. So a really important kind of frame of reference for the work that I'm getting to. Also wanted to talk about the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, and I wish I could stand in front of a group of people and just give the lecture like I'm supposed to do. That's just not how I am organized, and the people that work with me, they know this. I'm going to tell a few stories today in the limited amount of time that I have, and one of those is about meeting Syl Robinson. I was in my office in the winter session of 2010, and my now retired colleague Dan Doyle knocked on my door, and Dan said, hey, we just got a call from a woman named Syl Robinson at the Montana Board of Crime Control. Syl's the juvenile justice specialist, and she wants to talk to us about a project. I'm like, great, we're trying to find projects, this is a good deal. So Syl and a couple of her coworkers come down to see us, and essentially they have a series of projects that they want us to do. One of those was a disproportionate minority contact study, but the project that I'm going to talk about tonight is they had a great interest in validating a detention risk assessment instrument that was being used in 4 counties that were pilot sites for the Montana Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. In 2008, 4 counties agreed to be the initial sites for JDAI for Montana. Those sites were Cascade County, Hill County, Missoula County, and Yellowstone County. And so the work that I brought to present tonight, it's really based on a series of trips that the Criminology Research Group made to those 4 locations. In particular, I'm going to share information about 2 visits that we had to those 4 places. Trips to Missoula were not all that laborious, I'm going to admit that. You know, going to Great Falls depends on the day. Getting up to Havre, any Highliners in here? I love Havre. Not the best place to get to and from all of the time. And it's a haul to get to Billings. I mean, Montana's a big state. So we did our first round of visits there. I'd never met any of the juvenile probation chiefs in any of those counties. My first call to them were, hey, we've been hired by the Montana Board of Crime Control to do some work in your county. I was told to call you and tell you you need to organize a focus group for me and my research team, get everybody together, organize the thing, make sure everybody's there. When we get there, we're going to come in, we're going to run the thing, and we're going to leave. And to my great surprise, that's exactly what they did. I want to just tip my hat to the people working in the juvenile probation offices here in Missoula, in Havre, in Great Falls, and Billings, because instead of telling me to fly a kite, they just went after it, and they made sure that the right people got together in those rooms for us to talk about the issues that we needed to talk about. So JDAI, it's based on 8 core principles, but I really like the summary of the program that David Steinhardt put in a manual that he wrote in 2006. And it really sort of gets at sort of a continuation of things from the 1974 Act that we just talked about. It seemed like to me, whenever across the state of Montana, I visited with people about JDAI, they said, oh, well, you're the people that don't want to use detention anymore. And I would have to say, well, no, we're the people that want to make sure that we make really good decisions about using detention. So at no place in the philosophy for the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative does it says that we shouldn't use detention, but that we should try to reduce unnecessary and inappropriate confinement of juveniles, that we should try to improve crowding and general conditions in juvenile secure detention facilities, that we should encourage the development of alternatives to detention, and that we should discourage failure to appear and subsequent delinquent behavior. So I think all really good things, but again, in no place does it say in this philosophy we should never use detention facilities. The reality of the matter is the vast majority of kids, and I'm talking about the kids on the deep end of the system, the kids who have had numerous delinquency offenses and they've been given a number of chances to avoid longer-term placement in secure confinement. As we went through, one of the things that we did was a case processing summary, and we looked at over 1,200 detention placements. And some of those detention placements, actually 79 of those 1,296, ended up at the final placement in either Pine Hills for Boys or Riverside, our juvenile institutions for long-term placement. And I was absolutely amazed with the offenses that were listed as the most serious offense for those 79 juveniles. It was not serious crimes against persons. They were, in many cases, misdemeanor offenses. And so initially it was great alarm. I'm like, what are we doing? How do we allow a juvenile whose most serious offense to be placed in long-term secure placement in either Pine Hills or Riverside? Well, the reality of it was when we got in there and we actually looked, we had exhausted every other option for these youth. So my statement here tonight to every one of you is that the thing that distinguishes those youth who end up in long-term placement from those that don't isn't necessarily the severity of the offenses that they commit. It's the regularity or the number of offenses that they've committed to, in effect, earn their spot to be there. All right, one more slide, and then I'm actually going to get into some evidence-based practice work that we've been doing. So whenever we're talking about detention in the state of Montana, there are two state statutes from the Montana Codes annotated that deserve mentioning. The first of these, in section 5-322-2, is a long statute that talks about who has the authority to detain youth. And in the state of Montana, it's peace officers, law enforcement officers primarily, who are given the initial discretionary decision to make an arrest and make the initial placement in detention. Now, the statute clearly says that if a law enforcement officer is going to place a youth in detention, they must make a written notice to the probation officer. That's what the statute says. I'm going to tell you that in practice, what we observed is much different. The practice that we observed was that when juvenile probation officers come to work every day, the very first thing that somebody in that office does is they find the detention report. And they look at whether or not somebody was placed in detention since 5 o'clock, the close of business, the night before, or if it's a Monday, since 5 o'clock on Friday. If it's the case that there is a new admission into the detention facility, immediately the juvenile probation officers have to get to work, because the second part of this, Montana Codes Annotated 41-5-332.1, that's a mouthful, says that if a juvenile is placed in detention, they have a right to appear before a judge within 24 hours. In all 4 places where we worked, the probable cause hearing, what most of the probation officers that we worked with referred to as the detention hearings, those were one of the very first pieces of business on the judge's agenda for the day. And in fact, I remember them all being at 9 o'clock. And so before 9 o'clock every morning, somebody has to come in and has to do a workup on a kid that was put in detention since 5 o'clock the night before, right? It's a lot of work. And then they have to go, the probation officer has to go to court and make a recommendation to the judge. Now, the judge does not have to agree with the recommendation and can do other things, but I know that it's a big stressor, and it's something that we commonly observed, a distinction between the way the statute's written and the way that it actually kind of works in practice. I want to focus a little bit on this second statute. So notice that it says, hearing must be held within 24 hours, excluding weekends and legal holidays. So what happens if my son is a juvenile here in Missoula, and it's Friday mid-morning, and he does something with some of his friends where he's issued a citation that is a detainable citation? The probable cause hearing has already happened for the day, right? The judge has done that business between 9 and 10 o'clock. So what's going to happen is my son is going to sit in the detention facility on Friday. There's no courtroom work on Saturday. There's no courtroom work on Sunday. If Monday's a holiday, my son could sit in there up to 4 days before appearing before the judge. Now maybe there's a piece of this that says, well, yeah, your son committed an offense that he could be detained for. He should have sat 4 days. And I don't know that I want to disagree with that entirely, but I do want to share with you another story. And this story is something that just came about. So I'd kind of talked about in these first visits to these 4 counties that were our pilot sites for the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. We did focus groups in those counties. That was our first piece of work. But we also did face-to-face interviews with police officers, with juvenile probation officers, with judges and attorneys. And in one of the counties, we met a man that had been retired for over 10 years, but everybody insisted that he was a person that we needed to talk to. Everybody said, this is a guy that if you want to know about juvenile justice in this county, this is the person that you talk to. So we set up the time, got to meet the man, and talked a lot. And in short order, I realized that people did know what they were talking about. He had a tremendous wealth of knowledge. During his professional career, had worked in law enforcement, had been a chief probation officer, and had been in charge of the jail in the county. And he shared with me a story about when he was running the jail, about a youth who, in his words, committed a status offense, but was held in detention on a Friday. Friday afternoon, the juvenile's parents came in to see him. And the conversation, as it was relayed to me, is they came in to see the kid. They told him that they didn't know for sure if he was going to get out on Monday when he appeared before the judge, but whether it was Monday or some other time, that he wasn't coming home, that they had made arrangements for him to be in a foster care home. And sometime during that weekend, the kid learned that there was a void place in his cell where the camera that was recording didn't actually capture, and the kid hung himself, killed himself in the jail. And so you have this man who is so highly regarded in this county. He's in his 70s when we meet him. He's still a big, formidable man. And you can tell that it's still raw emotion. This thing happened over 30 years ago, and he's telling this story, and it's as vivid as it happened yesterday. So that really impacted kind of my frame of the importance of this work, and it's something that I hope that I never forget. All right, here we go. The fun stuff, we'll see if you agree. I'd like to introduce to you the Montana Risk Assessment Instrument. As we went around the probation offices in Missoula, in Havre, in Billings, and in Great Falls, we got to learn a lot about this instrument. One of the conditions that counties had to agree to in order to be a pilot site for the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative is they had to use this risk assessment instrument. And it was a pen and paper instrument. It's a really quite simple instrument. You put a little bit of information, demographic information on here about the kid. You have essentially 7 risk factors, and you sum up the score. And then based on that score, you have information about whether or not the kid poses a significant safety risk or flight risk. And based on the outcome of that score, there are 3 indicated decisions. I'll sort of talk about those in just a second. I want to, again, I told you I'd tell a few stories. My mind can't think unless I can tell a few stories in between the things that I do. When we went out to each of these 4 counties on our second trip, we had called ahead, and I'm really surprised that any of these juvenile probation officers speak to me today. Some of them I called and told them that I was going to be giving this talk, and they even wished me well. The second call after calling first and saying, hey, organize these focus groups and make sure everybody's there, and in many cases, not only were they all there, they even brought treats for us. I thought that was pretty good. The second call was, oh, we need you to go through the past 2 years of all of your juvenile court cases, and we need you to pull out the pen and paper version of the risk assessment instrument, because when we show up the next time, what we're going to do is lock ourselves in a room, make sure we have a nice room. If you can get water in there and treats again, that'd be great. But we're going to spend all day in that room, and what we're going to do is we're going to record all of the information off of this pen and paper instrument into a database so we can analyze whether or not this thing is actually doing the job that it was intended to do. And I remember we were in one of the offices and working away, and I mean, it's not really great work, it's not really fun work, it's very tedious work. And I was probably daydreaming, to be honest with you, but one of the research assistants came in and said, hey, I think we have a problem. I'm like, oh great, you know, I didn't want to have a problem, we're on the road. But the problem was that it appeared that 2 probation officers had completed a detention risk assessment instrument on the same kid for the same offense on the same day. So I looked at it, sure enough, the ID number matched, the offense matched, and the date matched. What didn't match were the numbers over here. The system for recording these scores was different, and the total score was different. So as a researcher, one of the things that I want to make sure of is that we're making apples to apples comparisons. And if people are not filling these things out the same way, then that causes problems for some of the generalizations that we can make at the end. And I remember I went out and got the supervisor in the office and said, hey, it appears that we have a duplicate ray. And the woman said, oh, don't worry about it. She's like, I'll go do it. We can shred those other 2, and you can use mine as the one that you enter in the database. I'm all right. About 15 minutes later, she comes back, and sure enough, a 3rd ray, guess what? Same kid, same offense, same date, different numbers. All right? So it's then when I started asking the question, how do people get trained on how to use this? And everybody kept telling me, nobody trains us to do this. We just go do it. We figure it out. And by damn, they do figure it out. Very innovative ways that people both manipulate the scores to reduce the number mostly. But it's at that point where I started realizing that you can have really good evidence-based practice tools, but if you don't have a really good systematic system on how those tools are used, they're not going to be all that helpful. All right? So that was a real heartbreaking but also enlightening discovery for us. So just a couple of things about the ray. First of all, this ray was adopted. It's an exact facsimile of an instrument that was developed in the state of Virginia in the late 1990s. Now, I don't know all that much about Virginia, but Virginia looks a lot different than Montana, both in terms of the composition of urban versus rural, and also the composition of minorities in Virginia versus Montana. So, you know, why we didn't think a little bit about this and why we adopted this just kind of wholesale, I don't really know. But I want to point out a couple of things with this tool because I'm going to show you some work that followed this. And I've been learning how to use PowerPoint a little more. I hope you all appreciate the big red bolded box. Thanks, Jackson Bunch, for that. So the first thing is that one of the key aspects of this risk assessment instrument is what was the most serious offense that the youth committed that brought them into court. And so it's not uncommon for, in a single interaction with a law enforcement officer, that a juvenile earns a series of tickets. And so what was supposed to happen is if there are more than one citation issued, find the most serious one, and then find the category that the offense fits in. Is it a felony against person? If so, the score that should go there is 15. If it's another felony, it should be 10. If it's a misdemeanor against person, 7, and other misdemeanors, 5. So using a sort of categorical scoring system where it doesn't matter what type of crime against person, doesn't matter other than it being a felony or a misdemeanor, you get kind of the same score. The second thing that I wanted to point out here is when you sum up those scores, the total possible points that can be earned on this risk assessment instrument is 66 points. All right, so if you're the top score on each of those 7 categories, the total score at the end is going to be 66. And something that we commonly heard in terms of criticisms of this tool was it is so easy to breach the 15-point threshold. And then behind that, we'd hear all of these innovative strategies that probation officers had developed to sort of reduce the number of points that were being assigned. So this red box shows the indicated decision based on the score that's earned. If the score is between 0 and 9, then according to the instrument, the juvenile doesn't pose a significant safety or flight risk. They should be released. If the score is between 10 and 14, a detention alternative is the recommended decision. Anything 15 points or higher is something that, according to the instrument, merits a secure detention placement. You'll notice underneath that there's the final decision. And the final decision is what actually happened. Was the youth detained? Were they released? Or were they released with conditions? And so one of the critical things about thinking about this piece of evidence-based practice is that some assessment tools do not provide for practitioner overrides. This is not one of those. So this is intended to be an assist for systematic decision making. But there are conditions under which a juvenile who doesn't score the 15 points might need to be held in detention. For example, if the offense that the juvenile is brought into court for is a crime against a family member, they can't go home. These are not adults. We can't just put them back out on the street. All right, so a lot of times the override's up where the indicated decision was either a detention alternative or a release. The explanation for that was the type of offense. It was just something where the juvenile could not go home. The other type of override is an override down, and we saw a lot of overrides down. We saw a lot of evidence to substantiate what these probation officers were telling us, how easy it was to trip that 15-point threshold, but yet not really believe that the juvenile wasn't going to come back to court like they were supposed to, or that they were going to commit an offense in a short period of time. This is the other thing that I really want to mention about this type of risk assessment. The period of risk for these risk assessment tools is typically 30 to 45 days. These are not intended to be long-term predictors. What we're talking about is, can we, with good faith, release a juvenile and believe that they will behave and they'll come back to court? And we're expecting that that process shouldn't take more than 30 or 45 days. All right, so Sue Robinson, bless her heart, I complained a lot about some of the initial things that we learned in the examination of the risk assessment instrument that's up on the overhead here. And her response to that was, well, we should develop a state-level work group to focus on detention decisions. And you, Professor Hollist, are going to chair said group. So my reward was, the next thing I know, I'm responsible for chairing a statewide work group that included people from all over juvenile justice in the state of Montana. Some that I knew, some that I didn't know, some that really kind of didn't know if they thought I should be doing that sort of thing. It was an interesting group. We worked for about a year. During that year's time, we came across David Steinhardt's publication in 2006. He wrote a manual that was funded by the Annie Casey Foundation and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention on best practices for risk assessment. And in the manual, he articulated what a good detention risk assessment instrument should look like, how it should be developed, and how it should be evaluated. And the piece about how it should be developed was the ultimate reason why we did that work group. Steinhardt argued that when researchers build these tools and then expect people to use them that haven't had any involvement in them, they're minimally successful. So the idea, as much as anything, was to have people work collaboratively, and then we could develop a bunch of additional champions who could go out and speak for the tool. So this next slide, this appears to be very similar to the slide that was just up there, but I want to convince your mind that this is a visual misrepresentation. This looks like another pen and paper instrument. What this actually is the 2013 Detention Risk Assessment Instrument prototype, right, that Patrick McKay on the Criminology Research Group was very influential in developing, but we caught a stroke of luck. In 2013, when we put this instrument together, the state of Montana was undergoing a structural change to the juvenile court assessment and tracking system. Millions of dollars were being put in to updates into the system, and we were lucky enough that we kind of sneaked in a little piece to automate the detention risk assessment instrument. And that was a great relief to me, because now, guess what? People can't mess around with the numbers, all right? This tool is intended to be used at the initial point of contact with law enforcement in the field. Because I don't know about you, the idea that we have detention risk assessment instruments as part of an evidence-based strategy that we use after the fact, the kids have already been placed in detention, and now we're going to take this thing and figure out whether or not they should continue to be there and should have been there in the first place. The idea is that we should make those decisions on the front end before the detention placement ever occurs. So the idea behind this tool, we had to have it automated. It was intended to be something that police officers across our state, many of whom have mobile data units, could pull this thing right up in the patrol car. They could put in some information on the individual. They could put in the offense associated with the citation that they were writing, if there were multiple, the most serious offense, and then they could get this detention risk assessment score to kind of help them determine whether or not the youth should be held and taken for consideration for detention placement. A couple other things that I'll point out about this tool is, first of all, you'll notice that we no longer have any sort of scores associated with the most serious offense alleged in the current referral, and that is that every possible citation for which a juvenile can be issued a ticket for has a unique risk to reoffend score, what we call the D-Ray score. Instead of the categorical system that existed where, you know, there are lots of different crimes against person, felony, and misdemeanor offenses, in the old Ray, you got the same score regardless of that. There are actually state statutes that mandate for certain offenses that if a juvenile commits those offenses, there's no decision making. They are required to be put in detention placement, and those offenses get a score of 15. They're the only ones in the whole inventory where that's the case. So it was really important for us. It was, again, based on this best practices model where each of those offenses should have a unique risk to reoffend score. The other information that appears in point 2, 3, and 4 here, and point 5, these really are pretty similar to the information that existed on the Virginia and the Montana adoption of the RAY, the Risk Assessment Instrument. But another thing that's kind of unique about the D-Ray is that we added a series of aggravating factors and mitigating factors. And again, this is something that the best practices guidelines argue for, a balanced set of mitigating and aggravating factors. And so you'll see here that there are 5 aggravating factors. There are 5 mitigating factors. The aggravating factors, you'll notice that there's a positive sign in the box next to those. There's a total of 5 additional points, depending on the yes or no conditions associated with the aggravating factors, where whatever the score is, up to that point, a youth can receive up to an additional 5 points, or they can have a reduction of up to 5 points. And if you look at those mitigating factors, these are things like not having an arrest in the last year. It's the first offense, those sorts of things. So unlike the predecessor to this tool, where the maximum total points was 66 points, the total possible points on this tool is 44 points. So it's a 30% reduction in the total possible points. And in our comparison of those two tools, had they been used in the field together, there would have been 100 fewer detention placements out of 1,200 using the detention risk assessment instrument versus the tool that was being used, the pen and paper version of the RAE. All right. Sorry, I'm manic about my time. I've got about 10 minutes. I've gone through this talk 4 or 5 times, and my margin of error is about 7 minutes. I mean, I've been an hour and 7 minutes. I've been 53 minutes. I'm trying to come in right on time. I think I'll be all right here. All right, the second spot, I told you there'd be 2. The second spot where I'm talking about detention, sort of the front end, short-term placement of youth versus incarceration on the back end. But I really thought that this figure was helpful. I remember last week in Professor Gross's talk, she had some information about cost, and it seemed like it was something that the group really grabbed onto. And I just want to point out, I don't think it's really too hard to see this. Placement of youth in secure detention is expensive. Now, I think that this chart is a little bit dated. It's from 2008. The information that I have about how much it costs to keep a kid in detention placement in the state of Montana, there are some variables depending on the treatment needs of the kid, but a rough estimate of that is about $250 a day. So if you multiply that $250 times 365 days, it's approximately $92,000 to keep a kid in detention for a year. And we can do many other things keeping them in their homes, keeping them out of those secure placements. The evidence on the harmful effects of juvenile detention are pretty overwhelming. When we place a kid in secure placement and detention, we remove them from their family, we remove them from their school, we remove them from their community. Many of the kids who are put in long-term detention drop out of school within 5 months, of release from detention. And the evidence is just not showing that the public safety benefit is there. So again, I'll go back to my original statement. The 2 conditions where we should ever consider placing a youth in detention should be when they pose a significant public safety threat or when they pose a significant flight threat. And if not, we need to get on the ball and figure out other things that we can do for these youth rather than putting them in a cell. Now, one of the things that I learned through the project that I've talked about today was that Missoula, we have quite a few resources. There are other things available in our community besides secure placement and detention for youth. We have group homes, we have places that we can put kids. Well, you go up to Hill County and Havre, and there's no detention alternatives, really, outside of probation and maybe a limited amount electronic monitoring. So one of my takeaways, I hope, for the group tonight is that if you have any influence at all on the thinking and decision making that's going on in our state, we should be appalled at the absence of things for youth in our state when they break the law. Now, I don't know if there's a single person in this room with good conscience that can say they were never a juvenile delinquent. And in fact, if you do that, I had a person do that last week, and I immediately just called foul. I'm like, wait a minute. And the reality of it was this person just didn't want to admit some of the things that they had done, which that's okay. All right, my last thing, and I'm running out of time a little bit here. I wanted to just show you something. This is a map that Patrick McKay and the Criminology Research Group built. Patrick is less than a year away from completing an interdisciplinary doctorate. We've had the great fortune of having Patrick as a master's student in sociology I think, Patrick, when did you graduate? 2010? All right. So for at least the past 8 or 9 years, we've had Patrick around. He has a tremendous interest in developing risk assessment instruments. But part of his PhD program is using maps and cartography. And so I really like this map. Essentially what this map is it's showing us the big white dots are the 5 regional detention facilities in the state of Montana. The black dots are the places where the city, municipal police departments, or county sheriff's offices are located. And these black lines are the distance that is required to travel if somebody here needs to be put here. And so Patrick has been using some mathematical models to look at whether or not distance traveled is a key predictor of the likelihood of detention placement. And guess what he's finding? 50 miles is the key. If you are a youth that lives within 50 miles of a regional detention facility, you are twice as likely to be placed in detention. And it's a practical consideration, I understand that. But it's not a public safety threat, and it's not a flight risk. And that's what we should be focusing on. So actually we came across this working up in Hill County. They shut down the local jail in Hill County. If you're a juvenile and you get in trouble in Hill County, man, they take you down to Great Falls. That's 110 miles one way. I mean, that's a whole day for a law enforcement officer to take the kid down, then come back only to go back down and get him again. So guess what happened to detention rates in Hill County when the local jail closed? They dropped dramatically. All right, so I know that we have the ability, I know that we have the capacity to make more critical decisions, more evidence-based decisions with the type of instruments that I've been talking about here today. So kind of in conclusion, I want to conclude with this. First of all, that I can't express the gratitude that I have to be able to do the work that I do, but to do it in the state of Montana and under the auspice of the University of Montana means a whole lot to me. My feeling on this is the University of Montana has a responsibility to the state to contribute to this type of work. That's why we have researchers at our university. I also believe very strongly in the value of applied research, its impact. I just want to acknowledge for a final time Syl Robinson. For the first time in my professional life, I met somebody who took a report with our work and just didn't put it up on a shelf. Syl did the exact opposite. She embedded our recommendations into 3- and 5-year plans. She had me lead this state-level work group. And there are still things from those initial reports that we wrote 7, 8 years ago that we're working on today. It wasn't just an academic exercise. But I'm also concerned. As many of you know, we're in a crisis economically here in the state of Montana. And as those cuts to our budget have been made, guess where the first places that money was coming from? Research. And so I am concerned as a citizen, I'm concerned as a father, and I'm concerned as a professor at the University of Montana that in terms of short-term planning and short-term thinking, we are causing great long-term damage to our ability to effectively promote and conduct evidence-based practice. I appreciate you all being here. I heard there was another talk tonight, a much more high-profile person. I hope it was worth your time. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you have questions, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you so we can capture what you have to say.
What are the protocols on the Indian reservations or for Indian youth that are off the reservations?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. How much time do we have? So if you think about that map that I put up there and the location of those regional detention facilities, the towns like Missoula where those detention facilities are also catchment areas for reservation communities. And so I didn't get to speak about the disproportionate minority contact work that our group has done, but in the 4 counties that we worked in, one of the reasons that we were there is they're counties that have evidence that show at that initial arrest and initial detention point of contact, American Indian youth are more likely than their white counterparts to have formal sanctions. So I know that's not answering your question. To answer your question, the reservations were invited to participate in the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, and I think 2 of them initially agreed, but we actually didn't do any work on any of the 7 reservations in Montana for this project. But I will tell you that one of the things that I learned through that work was when you think about the considerations that go into detaining a youth, I wish it were as simple as they pose a public safety threat, they're a flight risk. But unlike an adult, we have a legal responsibility. We can't just throw kids back out on the street. And American Indian youth present a really, really unique problem. And that is that oftentimes the youth that the probation officers that we interacted with were dealing with, they were youth that were living in places like Great Falls, in places like Billings and Missoula, but their home was actually back on the reservation. And even though they had an adult that could come down to the probation office and say, yes, this person lives with me, I'm responsible for their care, they weren't a legal guardian for the youth. And so legally, the court could not release the youth to that person. And so both in terms of the likelihood to be detained or not, but in particular for the amount of time that juvenile is going to spend in the detention facility, there are really a lot of practical explanations for that. I don't know if that got all of your question. It's a really, really super question.
Well, she's getting a microphone. Just as a frame of reference, at any given point on any given day, how many juveniles are in detention in the state of Montana?
Oh man, there's a guy here that actually knows that answer. Let me just, I don't know the answer, Jeff. I won't try to invent the answer. I will tell you that one of the things that we did is we looked at citations that were issued by law enforcement in those 4 counties for 2 years. And in Missoula Hill, Yellowstone, and Cascade County, there were about 7,300 citations that were issued during those 2 years. They resulted in 1,296 detention placements. So I think, man, it was kind of hard because, you know, Billings is such a big place, so the overwhelming majority of those were in the Billings office. And then, you know, Havre, I mean, there was a year we looked at Havre, yeah, it had like 13, 10, something like that. So I wish I could give you the exact number. That's the frame of reference that I have to provide.
Okay, my question is, you said we have a lot of people or a lot of kids that are being incarcerated for, other than the 2 reasons, which would be the flight risk and posing a harm, what were the things that you found out that they were incarcerated for from your study? Because some of them seem like they're pretty minor. They were just happening more, you know, too frequently. So what did you find that they were being incarcerated for that maybe they shouldn't have been?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. I'm going to have to think about my response to that for just a second. Initially, I was alarmed at how many of the youth were sitting in detention facilities as the result of status offenses. The status offense, these are these minor things like school truancy and minors in possession of alcohol and, you know, those sorts of things. But as I actually learned the system, I realized that it wasn't a status offense that resulted in the juvenile being placed there. They were on probation or they had formal court conditions. that committing that status offense was a violation of those court conditions or their probation, and so there was no other recourse but to place them there. Things that, and I mean this is sort of more anecdotally, is that in at least one of the offices that we worked in, one of the principal concerns that the office had was the number of females that were being placed in detention as the result of running away from home. And so when you really got in and you looked at those cases, it wasn't necessarily that those juveniles were bad people. They had very chaotic home lives. They were leaving home for a very good reason, and because their home lives were in such disarray, they were places that they couldn't be released back to. So at least initially, the only place to put those girls were detention facilities.
Okay, well, she's running up there. I noticed you have something up on the screen. Did you want to talk about that at all since you put it up there?
Well, see, Jeff, you're not privy to this, but me and Angela already made an agreement that we're going to shut this Q&A down 5 minutes early, because I don't know how many of you saw this, but I have a friend here tonight that I want to give some time to.
Hi, I'm a student in the social stratification class here at the university, and I just noticed that. But my question is there any type of alliance between the juvenile justice system and a mentor program like Big Brothers and Big Sisters that's proven effective in terms of the recidivism rate to help with first-time low-risk offenders?
I think this is a great question, and I'm really glad that there are some sociology students here this evening, regardless of whether or not you're here for extra credit in your social stratification course. And I don't know if it was a term and condition about you only get the extra credit if you ask a question, but that was a super question. And the way that I'd like to answer it is as follows. Something that consistently comes up in all of the work that we're doing on predicting recidivism is kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system and are put in detention, they're far more likely to have a subsequent offense and far more likely to be redetained. They come from households, families that are just, in many cases, in complete disarray. And so one of the things that we've been really interested in is what is the impact of a non-family adult in the life of the juvenile. And what we're finding is that in many cases that's absolutely consequential as an event to help mediate some of the chaotic problems that the juvenile may be experiencing in their home lives. So recently we were looking at a model where the outcome was trying to understand likelihood for detention. And in the model, we had a number of current and prior criminal history variables. And the overall greatest predictor in the model about what would lead to an increased likelihood in being placed in detention was the severity of the offense that the juvenile committed, in particular if they had multiple offenses in their prior record. But right behind the severity of the offense in terms of the magnitude was the presence or absence of a non-family adult in the juvenile's life. And it's just something that I think it makes good intuitive and practical sense, but it's something that really does matter. I know that from observations of a number of youth that I've interacted with who point blank told me that they wouldn't be in college if it wasn't for a neighbor or somebody else that kind of lifted them up and told them, hey, you're a good person and I believe that you can do this.
I feel a little bit like the mole in the room. My name is Tom Biltine. I'm the Youth Court Services Bureau Chief for the state of Montana. Hi, Dusten.
Hi, Tom.
Hi. We met. He was aware I was coming, so a huge appreciation for the information he presented. But just as a side note, we have 10 years of report cards on the Supreme Court's website that may answer some of your questions with regards to statistics and data within the state of Montana. to your question that, what's our average length of stay in detention, what's our current count, whatnot. But and my contact information is on that website. So you just Google Montana Supreme Court and then look for the youth court links, and you'll find some of that information. But what I want to stress more importantly is that all of the studies and the partnerships that we have done with the Criminal Research Group are on there as well. So it gives you an opportunity to see the information that Dusten has kind of alluded to in practice in our communities. Of particular excitement at this point, and I don't know that I've shared this with Dusten yet, is that one of the studies that the Criminal Research Group had done was the effectiveness of foster care placements over group home placements for kids. And we were successful in licensing our first juvenile probation foster care placement in Hamilton 3 weeks ago. So again, just another example of the work that's being done here applied in our system. So, but again, any information, I don't want to steal the mic, but I'm a Butte Irish Catholic boy, so if I keep it in my hand for too long, it won't go away. But again, information, look on our website, and again, my contact information. Hopefully it's there. I've been here in the position for a year now, so hopefully it's been updated. But give me a couple days to make sure that it is before you actually contact. So I just wanted to share that.
And I appreciate Tom being here. I know there's another question. I won't be too long about this, but Tom said he's a good Irish Catholic boy, but he's also a Butte guy. So I'm glad we got the mic out of his hand, because otherwise we'd have to amend the transcript for the recording here. Dig people from Butte.
I'm curious about what the $250 a day is buying. Is it including some education or counseling to these youth that are incarcerated?
Boy, that's a really super question as well. I think there are a lot of different answers to the question. The honest answer to the question is that in many cases, yes. I've pointed out some of the harmful aspects of a detention placement for youth, but the evidence shows that for some kids, the time when they're in youth detention is the only time in their life to that point where they've actually seen a medical doctor, where they've had a mental health evaluation, where they've actually had a tutor to help them understand some concept that they were working on in school. So I don't want people to walk away with this idea that it's just a horrible institution. It's not. And in fact, I just think we have tremendous people working in those places. The reality about the cost is that those institutions are expensive to run. The facilities themselves are expensive to run. In the late 1990s, the state of Montana decided that it was going to change the way that we do juvenile detention in the state. And so we went to these juvenile detention facilities. That was the model that the state decided that it needed to fund it. We didn't have enough money to do the things that we needed to do. And in response to that, some counties saw, I think, an economic opportunity, and they built their own detention facilities. I was reading an article on the Two Rivers detention facility in Hardin, Montana, and it's $26 million in the red now because there's nobody inside the facility. But the facility has to be heated in the wintertime, has to be cooled in the summertime, and you have to have at least minimal staff to operate the place. So part of the amount of money is that the institutions themselves are expensive to run. But I hope that somewhere in that mix, we have a focus on the care and well-being of the youth, and I think that's by and large true.
I've got a question in regards to the new assessment that you and your crew developed.
We're a crew now, Luke?
You're a crew.
All right. That gives us an edge. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Is there a systematic training for law enforcement officers on your new assessment?
Man.
And second, maybe two questions. Is there a plan to assess your new assessment?
Yes. The answer to your question is both yes and yes. And also, you've identified two things that I had in versions of this talk that I gave to my dog this afternoon that I didn't share with you fine folks. So I'll address both of those points. The first one is there a training associated with the detention risk assessment instrument? And the answer to that question is absolutely. In fact, it's a multi-part online training where Patrick McKay is the narrator of said training module. We wanted to do something where people didn't have to come to us to get the training. Within about an hour or two, you can get through all of the what we call the curriculum modules for the detention risk assessment instrument. And we have a reasonable belief that after you've gone through that, you should understand what the role and purpose of the instrument is, how the scoring works behind the scenes, and because it's an automated tool, you can't get in there and manipulate that anymore, so we're not too worried about that. But based on our experience with the lack of a proper training methodology for that pen and paper risk assessment instrument, we made developing those curriculum modules a priority, and it was something that our partners at the Montana Board of Crime Control were willing to fund to have us do. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it, Luke, is have we actually taken a look at whether or not the automated detention risk assessment instrument works? And the answer to that question is yes. There are some recommended thresholds that a good operating detention risk assessment instrument should meet. For example, the failure rate should be less than 10%. And the failure rate is the percentage of times where the detention risk assessment instrument says that the kid should be released, and he or she, during that 30 to 45 days, has a new misdemeanor or felony citation. And I think for the felonies, the failure rate was just over 5% for the detention risk assessment instrument. It was around 4% for misdemeanors. So in terms of the best practices guidelines for assessing that type of risk, definitely have that evidence. The other thing that we know about the detention risk assessment instrument is, and we tested this on a sample of about 2,500 kids. For all 2,500 kids, we generated the scores using the old risk assessment instrument, and we generated the scores using the new detention risk assessment instrument. And one of the things that we looked at was the ability to correctly identify youth who, when they were released or put into a detention alternative, did not have a subsequent misdemeanor or felony offense within that 30 or 45 days. And almost 96% of the kids, and this was over 2,000 of those kids, that we identified as low-risk kids, and the D-Ray indicated decision was either release or detention alternative. Over 96% of those kids did not have a new misdemeanor or felony offense within that 30 or 45-day risk period. Again, suggesting that it's a good tool for its intended purpose. Really, really good question.
Hi.
Hi, Daisy.
Thank you for your talk. I'm not in the social stratification class, but I wish I was. So I have two questions. One is just, I'm hoping you could define the term delinquency and juvenile delinquency. You started with that slide, but I don't really know what that term means. And I do know that I've only really heard it used to describe juveniles, not adults. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then my other question is, what's the relationship between class and either juvenile detention or getting an arrest as a juvenile? I grew up in the DC suburbs and was surrounded by many juveniles who were very insanely behaved, who never really interacted with the police. And so I don't know what the relationship between socioeconomic status or class is and juvenile delinquency, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Okay. Well, I think both of those are really good questions. I'll take each in turn, and you help me, Daisy, and I know you're pretty detail-oriented. If I forget about the second question by the time I get there, remind me about the question. So your first question is, what is juvenile delinquency? I mean, we could put Jim Burfind on the spot. He wrote the textbook on juvenile delinquency, but I'll give it a shot. And the way that I want to address your question is that juvenile delinquency isn't just committing infractions against the law. There are other reasons why youth can actually be involved in the juvenile justice system. Nationwide, our data suggests that about 80% of all of the youth who come into the juvenile justice system, they come in as the result of an interaction with a law enforcement officer. In the state of Montana, it's the issuing of a citation that starts that intake process. The other 20% of those youth come in as the result of complaints. Your neighbor can, call the cops and say your son was, going through their yard again, and why the hell do they have to cut across your yard? You spend a lot of time manicuring your grass, and you don't appreciate the Nike footprints that they leave when, okay, so that's part of it. Teachers can also bring juveniles into the court as a result of a complaint. So there are multiple ways that youth can actually become involved in the court, and that idea of juvenile delinquency, I hope that I'm communicating correctly, that it's broader than just law-violating behavior. All right, the second question, I have an answer. I'll give you the answer, and then I'm going to assess your nonverbal communication to see whether or not it's suitable or not. And I'm a story person, right? So I'm going to start out with a story. When I was a graduate student at Washington State University, I thought I was going to do my dissertation on street gangs. And so I went over to the Tri-Cities area in Washington, Kennewick, Richland, and Pasco, and I was really interested in Pasco. I got to spend a couple of years down in South America. I don't tell people I'm bilingual anymore, but I used to speak pretty good Spanish. And I had some friends that took me around Pasco, Washington. And what I found out about the crime problems, the delinquency problems in Pasco, Washington, was, at least the way it was explained to me, is rich kids from Richland and rich kids from Kennewick came to Pasco. They got in trouble there, and then they went home with their folks, and the poor kids in Pasco went to juvenile detention. So I don't know if that is enough to explain that. Is there a connection between class and involvement in the juvenile justice system and delinquency prevention, delinquent detention placement? Yes, there is. The relative risk of being involved in the juvenile justice system and being placed in detention is higher for kids who are poor.
Dusten, nice talk, and
Thanks,
I
Chris.
just want to make a comment. Here at the university, we're constantly being asked to demonstrate, do we have some kind of an impact, and is it statewide? What do we really do for the state of Montana? And I really liked your slide because it makes it clear that the kind of data you're gathering potentially impacts the lives of students all over the state. And not too long ago, the psychology department did an exercise where they tried to see where they affecting treatments around the state. It was just about every county in the state. If you put those two together, it shows that the social sciences at UM are having a statewide impact. So please share that slide with the appropriate folks so we can make sure everybody knows we're trying to follow through on what's expected of us.
Sure.
I think we'll let Dusten show his special presentation.
All right. Thank you so much. Just again, I know that you could have been many other places this evening. I'm so glad that you chose to be here. I know some people traveled here for my talk. I really, really appreciate the support. But some of you, I don't know if you noticed that Big Brothers Big Sisters has a table outside of the auditorium of the theater here tonight. And that's because one of the recruitment folks at Big Brothers Big Sisters, Savannah Sill, is a former sociology student at the University of Montana. And when I started thinking about giving this talk, I thought, nobody's given the people in the audience a charge. We're coming in, we're presenting our research, but man, shouldn't we be giving people a charge? So I'm going to try to run Savannah's video. I think it's less than 5 minutes. I don't know really how to get it started.
I can go up there and talk a little more.
Okay, let's do it. Come on up, Savannah. And as you're doing that, I'll try to, I think I have to, whoops. I mean, this is, go ahead. I don't think it's going to just start running on us, but maybe, I don't know if we want to see Greg's face the whole time either.
There we go. We'll get it figured out. I'm not the greatest with technology.
We'll try.
Thank you again, Dustin, for having me. Oh, there we go. I'll try that. Can you hear me okay? A little closer? Like that? Okay, there we go. So, yeah, thank you, Dustin, for having me and for your hard work and research. We really appreciate it. As you said, I'm Savannah with Big Brothers Big Sisters in Missoula, and I wanted to share a little bit more about our program and our current need for volunteers. We have 56 children who are still waiting for their very own big, many of which are little brothers. That waiting list continues to grow as agencies across the state are experiencing cuts to their services. The children that we serve, they're just in need of a friend, a mentor, and someone who will honestly just be there and have some fun with them. We really need big brothers, but many of our littles are willing to be matched with a big sister. So ladies, please consider being a part of maybe a couples match or being matched with a little brother, but we also do have little sisters waiting as well. More about us, we are a one-to-one mentoring program and best practices organization. Our focus is serving children who face adversity in some way, and that's a huge umbrella term, but certainly some challenges that face our youth in Missoula today. And we are here as an organization to provide mentorship and meaningful experiences. We utilize a lot of data and research to provide the best mentoring experience that we can, and we hope to change their life for the better forever. It's a meaningful and fun way to spend time with a child, but we're really focused on having a long-lasting impact on that child's life. We'll take a minute here to watch a video and learn a little bit more about that impact from an individual who grew up here in Missoula.
All right, so this is where it becomes a bit tricky.
And I was a little and big in the Big Brothers and Sisters program here in Missoula. I came from pretty humble beginnings. I mean, we were living in a trailer park. My mom was working 2 jobs in order to provide for us. My parents divorced when I was about 4 years old. I didn't see my real father really after the divorce, as there was nobody really in the picture for several years. I started kind of seeking attention from probably not your best role models. That really led to Mom looking to try to find somebody that could influence me in a more positive manner. Mike was that person. We did a lot of just normal things. We went to a lot of movies, played games and things like that. Now that I'm older, I can tell that things that he taught me were the choices that I made while I was younger were going to impact me later in my life. Without a big, I think that things would have been much different. I have so many kids that I grew up with that are incarcerated, dead, or just getting by. My wife and I are both professionals. We are very comfortable, and that's something I never would have anticipated. I always figured I would be working at a minimum wage job. My boys are, I couldn't be prouder of where they are, and I really do credit the Big Brothers and Sisters program with helping me to move to that avenue rather than taking the easy way out.
Alrighty, thank you. Greg is still very heavily involved with our organization, and he's been a phenomenal supporter and wonderful to have in our program. But back to our agency and a little more information of how to actually become a big and a volunteer. We do have a few small requirements to volunteer, and I'll be right outside with more information. But we do require a year-long commitment so you can have a truly meaningful impact on your little's life. And also we ask that you are available a couple hours each week for consistency. That consistency is really important to our agency and the children that we serve. It's incredibly valuable for a child's life. Of course, a few weeks here and there aren't going to work throughout the year, but still having a consistent caring adult in your life is extremely important. And then, yeah, I mean, you're going to be spending a couple hours with the little each week, but you're going to be enjoying the things that you like to do. You know, think about your interests and hobbies and try to envision sharing those enjoyable moments with the little. We do information and gather interviews with everyone involved, so that way you can make hit it off right from the very beginning and make really solid matches. And so you guys are both going out and enjoying the things that you enjoy to do. As a professional organization, we provide numerous resources and regular support for every match. So we are there to celebrate those successes and also help with any challenges along the way. So yeah. Please come find me out front. Take one of our cards if you want to give us a call, go over more questions that you may have. I really hope this is a great fit for some of you, and I hope we have some future bigs here tonight. But if you know you absolutely can't commit to meeting with a child for a full year or commit to meeting weekly for a couple hours each week, please consider donating to the cost of a match. It only costs just over $1,000 for a little to be matched for one full year. But anything helps, and also every penny that we raise here stays here in Missoula to serve the children that in our community. But yeah, thank you for having me, and let me talk a little more about Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I look forward to talking with more of you outside. Thank you.
One more hand for Dusten. Remember, next week is our final lecture of the season, and we'll have a panel, and a little bit different than having a talking head up ahead of us. It should be very, very interesting. We're going to have an opportunity to learn about knowing. And then always remember, at the end of the last lecture, we do have a very nice reception afterwards. So please plan on joining us next week. Thank you.